Okay, so you should be on your Using Quadrilaterals Properties packet, and we're going to go through the properties that are listed here and talk about what they mean and mark them on our diagram. So that's where we're going to be starting. You can have the colors out so you can do color coding and follow along with me. So the first property is that opposite sides are parallel. Remember that this word opposite means across. So the sides across from each other are parallel. That would be the top and the bottom, and then also the two sides. And remember that we mark those with arrows. Okay, the next one is that opposite sides are congruent. So that means the sides across from each other that are parallel, they're also congruent to each other. So we can put our tick marks to show that they're congruent. We also could use our colors to make it stand out for us that the sides across from each other are congruent. Alright, so next is that opposite angles are congruent. So the angles across from each other are the same. So I'm going to mark those with the same arc. Okay, those angles are congruent. The next one is consecutive angles are supplementary. So just to talk quickly about what consecutive means, our new team, the Vegas Golden Knights, they broke a record. Yeah, that's our hockey team. They broke a record to start the season because they had 9 consecutive wins. So if you could think about what consecutive means in that context, it will help you out in this context as well. So they had 9 consecutive wins. So you may have figured it out. Consecutive means in a row. So the angles in a row are supplementary. They add up to 180. So that would be these two angles. They're in a row. They equal 180, and we could go all the way around the parallelogram that way. These two angles, they equal 180. These two angles equal 180, and same with these two. So all the way around the angles that are in a row or even next to each other, they equal 180. Okay, and then our last property is that diagonals bisect each other. Remember, bisect means to cut in half. Cut in half. So our diagonals cut each other in half. That means that this half is congruent to this half, and same with the other two halves. They're congruent to each other. So I could, pick a new 2 colors to use and show my congruent diagonal halves. Okay, so that's all the properties of a parallelogram. We're going to do this example 1 to, kind of just identify how those properties work. So I'm actually just going to do part A with you because when we name a parallelogram, what we have to do is name it by the outside vertices. We don't include this vertex in the middle E, just the outside 4 vertices of the quadrilateral. And so if we started at D, we could say D, A, B, C, or we could say D, C, B, A, and you could start with any letter. You just need to go around in order. So D, A, B, C would work. Okay, I'm going to leave the rest of the examples for you to do. When you get to the bottom and we're working with the angles, remember that any of the angle properties that we've been using for the past, month with triangles, those are still going to be used here. So if you look at when we have our 2 diagonals, we do have some triangles that are existing in the middle of the parallelogram. So we can use our property that all angles of a triangle add up to 180. We also have linear pairs. We have angles next to each other, like these two. They form a line right right here, so those add up to 180. We also have vertical angles and alternate interior angles, so make sure you're referencing your notes and using all of those angle pairs that we've talked about previously. So you could pause the video and do the example problems and then resume to finish the notes, or you can go through all the notes and go back to the examples. I think I kind of recommend pausing, doing the examples, and then resuming the notes. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is rectangle. So properties of a rectangle. So if you look at the first 5 properties, these are exactly the same as what we just talked about in the parallelogram. So if you remember anything out of all of these properties, I know it's a lot, we want to remember those first 5. So I'm going to start marking them the same way. So we said opposite sides are parallel, the sides across from each other are parallel. We mark those with arrows. Opposite sides are also congruent. The sides across from each other are congruent. We mark those with a tick mark. We also could use our colors and color code them. Oops. Okay. Then we have that opposite angles are congruent, but if we look down at property 6, it also says that we have 4 right angles. So if I just mark the right angles, that actually takes care of opposite angles being congruent, because if I look at the angles across from each other, they're all 90. They're both 90, so they're obviously congruent. We still have number 4, which is consecutive angles are supplementary. So these 2 angles right next to each other are supplementary, and we know that 90 plus 90 does equal 180. And the last 2 diagonals bisect each other, and diagonals are congruent. So on the parallelogram, because it was slanted, we didn't have congruent angles or congruent diagonals, just their halves were. But now that the diagonals themselves are congruent, that means all 4 of these little halves are the same. Okay, so all 4 of those halves are the same. We can color code them all the same color. So we have 4 diagonal halves that are the same. All right, and as I move to my example, I'm going to leave this for you to do, but what I do want to point out is we have these 4 things that were given, and it's really important to take these and put them on the diagram so we can see where they are. So angle 1 is 70. I'm going to label that here. Angle 7 is 20. Line segment CN is 15. And KL is 16. Okay, now as I start solving things, I can write it over here, but I can also write it in the diagram, and seeing things that I'm going to have to use to find other parts, drawing it in there helps me. Also remember that all 4 of these angles are 90-degree angles. So that should help you, find angle 8 right here. If this angle is 20, we could think about what other part of this angle would make the whole thing 90. And so another thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to go through an order. So you don't have to start with angle 2 and go through an order. You can start wherever you want. Maybe just find what kind of stands out to you with the properties that you know. Okay, so again, we can pause here and work through this example and then resume the video to go over the properties of a rhombus. All right, so properties of a rhombus. Again, we have the same first 5 properties that we did with a parallelogram. Opposite sides are parallel. We also have opposite sides congruent. But when I look down at number 6, not only are opposite sides congruent, I have 4 congruent sides. So these sides across from each other are the same, but they're also the same as the other 2 sides that are across from each other. So on the rhombus, we have 4 congruent sides. Some of us think of the rhombus as like a tilted square. You know, it has 4 congruent sides, but it doesn't have right angles, so it's not upright. It's a little tilted. Okay, we still have opposite angles are congruent. So these angles and these angles are the same. And then we have consecutive angles supplementary. So these angles that are in a row, those equal 180. The diagonals bisect each other like they did in the other ones, and now the diagonals are not congruent anymore like the rectangle because the shape is tilted. So I do have to show that my 2 diagonal halves are different, except for they're the same, you know, as the other half in the same diagonal. So if I'm in a color code, I need to use 2 colors for these diagonals. Okay. So another thing is that the diagonals are perpendicular. Remember, that means they form a right angle. So perpendicular, we form a 90-degree angle. So I have a 90-degree angle here where they intersect. I actually have a 90-degree angle on all 4 of these angles where the diagonals intersect each other. And then the last part is that diagonals bisect opposite angles. So the diagonals are cutting these opposite angles in half. So here that means this half is congruent to this half. So I'm putting little tick marks to kind of make it look like these are 2 different halves. And so if this angle is congruent to the opposite angle on the other side. So this notes video will be... Okay, so these opposite angles, you know, the angle opposite here, could mark these 2. That means all 4 of these little halves are the same because the opposite angles were the same and then they're being cut in half, so each little half is the same. And that's the same for the other 2 pairs of opposite angles, so these 2 halves and these 2 halves are all the same. Okay, so those are properties of a rhombus. I'm going to stop the video here and I'll resume one for a square. If you're getting the hang of, you know, how I'm going through and marking and color coding, you could go on to the square on your own, but make sure you go through and do these examples and be working together. And I'll see you in class next time and answer any questions that you have.